Okay, good evening, everyone. It's now 7 p.m., and so we're going to get started. I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kelta Coomber, and I'm a Senior Engagement Advisor with the City of Edmonton. It's my pleasure to be the moderator for this evening's information session. We've organized tonight's event because we know there are many questions from the community about this proposed supportive housing development in Westmount, and we want to provide you with as much information as possible and answer your questions. Of course, to adhere to COVID-19 health and physical distancing guidelines, this is a virtual session. In order to submit questions during this session, you can email supportivehousing@edmonton.ca. That email address is actually on the screen as well for your reference. We have many pre-submitted questions as well from community members, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can in the time we have tonight. Any questions we can't get to due to time, we will answer those via email following today's event. We'll also be looking at scheduling another Q&A virtually at a later date. Of course, in addition, our team is always available to chat with you, and we can be reached through 311 or by emailing supportivehousing@edmonton.ca. Now, turning to tonight's event, we will begin with a presentation and then move into a Q&A to get to your questions, and we'll have the majority of our time for your questions. We've assembled a panel of experts to help answer your questions, and we selected these panelists based on the types of inquiries we've been hearing from the community up to this point. I now would like to introduce the panelists, and if you could each wave when I call your name. So our first panelist is Brendan Pinches. He is a program manager with the Project Development Unit in the city's Affordable Housing and Homelessness section. Brendan leads a team to identify, acquire, and develop affordable housing sites with a focus on contributing to 900 units of supportive housing. Thanks, Brendan, for being here. Next is Mike Kuntz. He is a project manager in facility planning and design with integrated infrastructure services at the City of Edmonton. Hi, Mike. Next is Emily Dietrich. She is the Chief Programs Officer for Homeward Trust Edmonton. She is responsible for oversight and delivery of programs to end homelessness, which includes supportive housing. Emily also lives in Westmount. Finally, we have Inspector Dan Jones. He has worked with the Edmonton Police Service for 23 years. He is an inspector in the Research and Community Solutions Accelerator and a member of the Community and Wellbeing Task Force. Inspector Jones has a master's degree in criminology and is working towards a PhD. We're going to start with Brendan and Mike, who will be making a presentation about the project. And once again, this presentation has been informed by questions we've received so far, and we're wanting to provide as much information up front as possible. Following the presentation, Emily and Dan will share a few opening comments, and then we will get right into your questions. So over to you, Brendan.
Thanks, Kelta, and thank you everyone for joining us here this evening. We know Westmount is a very engaged community, and we're committed to sharing information that we have about this project with you. So I'd like to begin with this presentation and a bit of background about supportive housing and why it's needed here in Edmonton. It's important to understand why supportive housing is so badly needed in Edmonton. The number of people experiencing homelessness in our city fluctuates, but it's been steady at around 2,000 homeless individuals for the last year throughout COVID-19. The numbers on the screen are up to date as of this week. There are 2,015 Edmontonians with no permanent home. Right now, around 584 people are sleeping outside, and around 342 are staying in emergency shelters. The solution to homelessness is housing and support, and that's why the city's top housing priority is to build 900 new units of supportive housing by 2024. Right now, the city has two avenues for achieving our supportive housing goals. The first is providing grants through our Affordable Housing Investment Program. Through that program, nonprofit housing developers apply for capital grants for their capital projects, some of which include supportive housing. The second, which is relevant to the Westmount site, is our partnership with Homeward Trust. So a bit of background on Homeward Trust. It is a not-for-profit organization responsible for implementing local efforts to end homelessness. It receives funding from all levels of government. Their work is grounded in the housing first approach, which is to transition people out of homelessness and into permanent housing quickly and without preconditions, and then provide them with the supports they need to maintain that housing. This is a proven intervention and a model that's already in place in Edmonton. Locally, more than 80% of people who participate in Housing First programs are still housed 12 months later. Homeward Trust manages supportive housing, which is why we're here today to talk about that. It also may be helpful to speak to what supportive housing is not. It is not a shelter, it is not a drop-in service, it's not bridge housing or a halfway house or any other type of temporary accommodation. It is long-term housing where residents sign a lease and pay rent while also receiving financial support and the 24/7 health, wellness, and life skills support they need to succeed in that housing. As I said earlier, we set a goal to build 900 units of supportive housing by 2024. In 2018, City Administration made a commitment to Council to identify the first 4 sites. We took an inventory of our surplus city-owned land that could be developed for this purpose and found the Inglewood, King Edward Park, Terrace Heights, and Wellington sites. The site in Westmount has a unique history, which I'll get into on the next slide. The city does not typically build or operate supportive housing, so we looked to partner with a nonprofit organization that could take on that role. Originally, our city role was to provide land and capital costs, and I'll explain how that role has changed since 2018 in the next slides as well. The city chose to partner with Homeward Trust because it is a trusted organization with experience and capacity to take on a project of this scale. Homeward Trust can also provide the operating costs for the developments once they are complete. Together, the city and Homeward Trust made funding applications to the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, to help fund the project as it was originally envisioned. City Council was aware of the proposed partnership and formally approved this approach with the approval of the land sale of the first 4 sites in June 2020. In December 2019, City Council asked administration to begin planning for a 5th supportive housing site in response to the persistent issue of encampments. In June 2020, Council approved the city's portion of the funding for all 5 sites. We had not identified a potential location for the 5th site at that time, so the Westmount location was not part of that land sale and public engagement process for the first 4 sites. After a review of the municipal inventory, we were not able to identify a piece of city-owned land that was surplus, appropriate for residential development, and close to the amenities that are desirable for this type of housing, such as transit, shopping centers, and recreation opportunities. The city's real estate section works on behalf of other departments to purchase land for municipal needs, and the Westmount site was purchased for housing's general inventory in August 2020 and then selected as the 5th site later in the fall. At the same time, the federal government announced the Rapid Housing Initiative to address urgent housing needs, especially in the context of COVID-19. This presented a new funding opportunity for the first 5 sites, but it also came with new parameters. Specifically, the funding must be used for developments that can be completed by the end of 2021. The City and Homeward Trust submitted a new funding application for all 5 sites. 2 have been approved so far, and we expect more will be provided, allowing previously committed city funds to go to additional affordable and supportive housing developments in the future. With this new funding source, it was decided that all 5 developments would move forward on the same expedited construction timeline. Given the speed and scale of this approach, we had to reimagine the development process. In partnership with Homeward Trust, we decided to leverage the city's development expertise in major infrastructure projects by bringing in the Integrated Infrastructure Services Department. So this slide shows a breakdown of the roles of the city and Homeward Trust. Affordable housing and homelessness is responsible for meeting the city's affordable housing goals. For the Westmount site, we are providing the land, coordinating capital funding, and leading public engagement. Our infrastructure department, IIS, is managing the development and delivery of the supportive housing. This includes hiring and overseeing the activities of the architect and construction manager. If the land sale is approved, and after completion of public engagement and construction, ownership will then transfer to Homeward Trust. Homeward Trust will select and contract an operator, and Homeward Trust will be the property manager and coordinate resident referrals. There were many moving pieces throughout the last quarter of 2020. Once the project plan was in place, we were ready to reach out to the community. In January of this year, we reached out to key stakeholder groups in Westmount and Inglewood, including the community leagues, the BIAs, and the West Glen and Westmount schools. On February 1st, we sent a mail out to residents living near the proposed development and launched the project website. The agenda for our original council date changed, and we are now going to executive committee with the proposed land sale on Monday, March 1st. Executive committee will make a recommendation on whether to move forward to council. If they do, it will go to council for a decision on March 15th. If the land sale is approved, we will begin public engagement on a good neighbor plan, which I'll talk more about on coming slide. Demolition of the existing buildings on the site is expected in March. A What We Heard report from the public engagement process will follow that in May. Construction will take place over the summer. We expect the building will be complete by the end of 2021, at which point we'll transfer the building ownership to Homeward Trust. Public engagement. That's focused on gathering input that will help the operator create a good neighbor plan, which is a tool for developing and maintaining a positive relationship between the supportive housing and the community. Emily from Homeward Trust will speak more to that in our panel discussion, but essentially the good neighbor plan outlines the shared commitments of the operator and the community, and it identifies a contact for the community. It will also include an issue resolution process through which the community and supportive housing site can work together to resolve any concerns. Our team is available throughout this process to answer questions, and you can reach out to us at our email address listed at the top of the screen, like Kelta pointed out. And before we get to the Q&A, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Mike Kuntz from IIS, to speak to the design. Mike?
Thanks, Brendan.
Welcome.
So the City and Homeward Trust have partnered to create well-designed supportive housing, and this is permanent supportive housing, and we want that to be built to last. So the first 5 sites, including Westmount, are being designed by GEC Architecture, who's one of Edmonton's leading design firms. The design right now is nearing the end of the concept phase. And as you likely saw on the website, we're aiming for approximately 60 units on this site, and the final unit count is 54 over the 4 floors. So these are primarily bachelor suites and barrier-free or accessible suites for people with disabilities. So supportive housing units are smaller than typical apartments, and we'll find them typically around 300 to 500 square feet, which allows us to fit more units in the building, and I'll get to more of that in a moment. So each unit will have its own kitchen and bathroom. There will be common indoor spaces for programming that supports the residents, as well as outdoor space for the residents, including garden beds. There will be 14 parking spots on site, including 9 accessible parking stalls. Residents don't typically own their own vehicles, so these will be available to staff or visitors when they're not needed by the residents. So I understand there's interest in how we're able to fit 54 units on this site. So to better talk through this, let's start by looking at our current layout for a typical apartment unit in this building. So Brendan, if you can go to the next slide, please. So apartment buildings in the city often have a mix of 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, even 3 bedroom units, as well as studio suites. So obviously 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units are larger than studio units, and therefore they'll take up more space in the building. So in this building, most of the units will be studios. So that allows us to be more efficient with the available space and develop more units in the area that a typical apartment might prioritize larger individual units. So most of the units in the building will be studio suites, as I mentioned, or bachelor suites, bachelorette suites, you might know them as. So it'll be laid out as shown here. This studio suite is a self-contained living space, much like you might find in a studio unit in any residential apartment building. So up in the upper left-hand corner there, you'll note a lockable entry door from the corridor that opens into the living space, where you'll see the galley-style kitchen, complete with a stove, a sink, a fridge, a space for kitchen table and chairs, a love seat or couch, and the bed. Each unit also will contain a washroom with a bath or shower and toilet and sink. So this is a modestly sized studio at about 350 square feet. During this process that we've been under for the last little bit here, I've learned a ton. One of the things I learned from Homeward Trust is that a modestly sized living space such as these studios can often be a better solution for an individual who's moving out of homelessness. Having a smaller space that's all theirs and that they're now responsible for, and they can decorate it and they can clean and cook, and well, they live in it, and it's easier to do that in this smaller place than a larger apartment. So another reason why we're looking at more studio suites on this site. So earlier I did say most units will be studios, as shown here. One of our funding requirements is that we provide 15% of units as accessible units. So in this building, that means 9 of the units will be 1 bedroom barrier-free units, suitable for people with mobility challenges. So those barrier-free units are typically a little bigger because they're 1 bedroom, and I'll show you an image in a moment of those. So let's move and look at how these units will be arranged on a typical floor plate. So next slide, please, Brendan. So this, as mentioned, will be a 4-story building. This image shows where we're at for laying out a typical floor plate right now. This represents the layout for the floors 2 through 4, so 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floors. So you'll notice that most of the units are studio units that we just looked at previously, that exact same layout. This layout shows 16 units on this floor, and so each of the 3 floors would have 16 units on them. Up in the northwest corner of the building, you'll see a couple of the 1-bedroom accessible units that I just mentioned. You can see that the space in these 1 bedrooms is a bit more generous, allowing for the unimpeded movement of person in a wheelchair, for example. The 3rd accessible unit is found on this floor is found down in the southwest corner. Each floor has a laundry space. There's elevators, mechanical space, stairwells, and in the upper left-hand corner is a balcony. So this is a screen balcony. They're visually screened for residents' privacy, and that's located up on the northwest corner of the building there. So another thing to note is that each suite will have a window, of course. In this configuration, the suite windows for all of the units on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floors face north to 111th, they'll face west to 130th Street, or they face east onto the lane or the alley. Let's look now at how this L-shaped plan fits, this L-shaped plan that's the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floor, how it stacks on top of the main floor level, and how the rest of the site's laid out. So Brendan, if we can move to the next slide. So here we have an image of the site plan currently. The main floor of the building is the portion that's colored a very light blue in the center there. So the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floors that we just looked at, those are stacked on top of this and are shown in the dotted red outline. So if you can see that dotted red outline, that's where the floors above, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floors would fit above this main floor. So as you can see, the east portion of that L from the floors above is cantilevered, or maybe more accurately, is built on columns above some of those parking stalls. So if we stay inside the building for now, for those of you who are quicker at math than maybe me, You're probably wondering how we get to 54 units when we only had 16 units on each of the 3 floors above. So it was 48 units above on the 3 floors, second, third, and fourth floor. And on the, so if you look here on the south edge of the building, we're accommodating the remaining 6 units on the main floor as shown there. So the main floor will host other spaces that support the residents. So such as office space for the staff, meeting room, social communal gathering space, like for when COVID concerns are perhaps less than they are now. You'll note that this part of the design is not yet resolved, and that's something we're currently working with Homeward Trust and future operators to understand how to best arrange that space. So if we move outside our building, let's start up at the top left there, up near our windrows. So that's the northwest of the site, and that's also where our building's entry would be. And that provides our welcoming presence and ample connections to 111th Ave and the transit bus stop to the north, and excellent pedestrian connection to nearby amenities such as Westmount Mall, the Peter Hemingway Rec Center, and even a Woodcroft Library. So around the entry, we're also showing abundant bicycle parking as required by our zoning. To the east, let's jump back to the, so if you look at those, there's 8 of those green rectangles there on the west edge of the building. So those indicate planter boxes that will provide residents with gardening opportunities. So new trees and shrubs will also be planted around the site as shown. And to the east or rear of the site, you notice the parking lot there where we show our 14 stalls that we mentioned. To meet zoning requirements, we must provide an accessible stall for every accessible or barrier-free living unit. So that's 9 accessible stalls, which you notice there. Now, from other supportive housing projects, we know that very few residents that live here will own a vehicle. So after the parking is allocated to residents who need a stall, the rest of the parking can be allocated or used by visitors or staff working at the site. We are also showing the waste and recycling enclosure that meets the requirements of waste collection, and the power transformer at the southeast corner of the site as well. So next slide, please, Brendan. So the last image I have to share with everyone is this aerial or AXO view. Here we are looking from the northwest. It's kind of hovering high above the nearby Westmount Junior High School across 111th Ave. So first, I want to be clear that this is a massing model. This is not a design. So the intent of this image is to show the mass of the building as it relates to the other nearby buildings. For example, you can see that the footprint of our Westmount supportive housing, the L-shaped form, is similar to the condominium across the alley or lane. The maximum height that we're permitted to build for this zoning is 14.5 meters. And that height of that 4 stories of supportive housing is approximately the same height as the peaks of the sort of fan-shaped building to the west across 130th Street there. So that's a similar height as what we're permitted to build to on this site. Back to windows for a moment. The only windows that face south will be that 6 units on the main floor that I mentioned previously. We use appropriate setbacks from the property line, as well as planting materials, a privacy fence, as well as curtains and blinds to ensure privacy for those tenants and as well for the immediate neighbor. So all other units, for all the units above the ground floor on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floor face 130th Street, 111th Ave or the laneway, as I mentioned previously. At this point, you may be wondering what the building will look like. Well, we are too. While this model shows us kind of how it's going to sit on the site, we're still waiting to see what the exterior materials, colors, and even roofline will look like. So this isn't going to, you're not going to see this checker box or Lego-like structure that's shown here when we see the lines that separate the units. But once our architects complete some more design and provide a renderings, we're excited to share that with you. So I will hand it back to Kelton now for the Q&As.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Brendan. And actually, before we get into the Q&As, I'm just going to throw it over to Emily and Dan for quick opening comments. Emily, why don't we start with you?
Great. Thanks so much. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what supportive housing was and practically speaking what it means in terms of practice. And of course, I want to talk a little bit too about the why. Why does supportive housing matter? So it's already been said, but it's worth just emphasizing. Supportive housing is designed to be a residential building. So it's someone's home for sure and first. So it's not an institution. So what that means, practically speaking, is folks have their own apartment and they actually have a lease under the Residential Tenancy Act. And that lease protects them and affords them the rights that anyone would have if they were renting an apartment in your neighborhood. The part that makes it supportive housing is that in addition to having a lease and a home, whether it's a studio or a one-bedroom apartment, as Mike described, and resident choice is really important. So we work with people to find out where they want to live and what kind of unit they want to live in. In addition to that, it's there's supports on site. So supports is kind of like program language for saying, you know, how can we work with someone to understand who they are and what their needs are, and what do they need to help be able to retain and keep their housing. So that could look like many different things. It could be some really primary things that happen at the start is sometimes helping them secure a secure income, an income source. It can look at practical daily living skills, such as how to cook. Like, for example, the main floor of this supportive housing site is very likely to have a training or a cooking or a workshop kitchen. It can also look at connecting folks to the healthcare system. It's actually very staggering when you start to work in this industry to understand the intersection between poor health and homelessness. And, you know, if you ever seen someone who's experienced homelessness for a long time, they often look many, many years older than they actually are because they've lived really, really hard lives. And so one of the things that is very challenging is accessing the healthcare system when you don't have a fixed address. So one of the important parts of supports is connecting people to the healthcare system. In terms of everyone wants to know who's going to live there. And I've done many sessions like this, and I've answered the question many times, but it's never seems to be specific enough. And I guess the reason why my answer is never specific enough is that there is not one type of person who has experienced homelessness that needs to live in supportive housing. People's journeys are different to needing supportive housing. And it's really about Homeward Trust's role, which is to contract a community service agency to operate the site. And those staff are experts in working with a population that has experienced the challenges that they have. And they work to understand who people are and what their needs are and what their wants are. And then they design and work with them to give them those supports. And so it's a very diverse group of people. Typically speaking, things they have in common is that they need access to health supports. They need access to have some supports for helping with daily living. But the sites that we're talking about, the folks can still live independently. We're very focused on designing programs that encourage independence, and also we do believe in people. And so what I mean by that is people aren't stuck. They can recover in terms of become more independent, do all sorts of things they want to do, especially if they have the supports. And so that's the model in terms of how who we're working with and how we do that. Something I guess that's important to understand is that you can't just walk up to this site, which is basically like an apartment building but has staff on the main floor, and just say, I want to live here. That's just not how it works. So I don't know if anyone's been downtown at any of the shelters, not to call any of them out because that's not what I'm trying to do, but sometimes you see people wrapped around the building at the main shelter downtown because they're trying to get in at night. That's not what this is. This is permanent housing. This is someone's apartment. And what's more is Homeward Trust has what's called a coordinated access system. And so what that means is there's over 80 different locations in the city that are set up connected to our system, which means if someone's experiencing homelessness, they have one entry into a common system that helps bridge them to solve their problem of homelessness. And so through that intake process, we ask a lot of questions to learn who people are. We like to understand their housing history and to better understand how we can help them stay housed and get housed. And so it's part of that coordinated access system where someone may be matched to a supportive housing site. And once they're matched through our coordinated access system, it's still on the operator of that site, which we contract a community service agency to operate that site, to review the referral and to make sure that person is a good fit. And so that usually involves understanding a little bit more about their needs. It often involves an interview. And it's also a really key thing is thinking about how that person will fit in terms of the community that's already there. So we're part of a broader community in a neighborhood that's actually my neighborhood if we're talking about the Westmount neighborhood. So we're talking about the broader community, but also the community in the building. And so it's really about creating a good community. And so that intake process is key. No one's just going to walk up or stand in lines or anything like that. There's a little bit more to it. And I guess the final, and I'd say perhaps the most important thing, is that the why this matters is really important. And why supportive housing is really important is that we can't actually end our situation of homelessness without having supportive housing, because most of the folks we work with can live in market housing without having those extra supports, but there is a group of people that really need this supportive housing. And so I just wanted to just share a couple things like that, and I think Dan was going to have a few opening remarks as well.
Yes, thanks, Emily. And over to you, Dan.
Thanks very much. Yeah, my name's Dan Jones. I've been with the Edmonton Police Service for almost 24 years. I worked in corrections before that, and then I started my foray into academia. And my research is actually in and around individuals who are incarcerated in institutions. And one of the things that I've learned through my schooling and my history of policing is a lot of times homelessness is a symptom of trauma. And a lot of times criminality is symptomatic as well, and survivalist. And when people don't have homes and don't have places to live, they commit crimes. When people have homes and have places to live, they don't. We have a population of people that need our help. We have a population that needs support. And Emily brought up a great point. People are always asking, what kind of people are living here? And my answer is, if you've met one homeless person, you've met one homeless person. And everyone's journey is different. My other answer is, we are in a society that has the ability to help people. We're also in a society that has, unfortunately, the ability to label people. And we label people as homeless, and we label people as criminals, and we label people as all kinds of things. And when we do that, people strive for the label that they're given. And when we give them opportunities like supportive housing, they get out of that label and become the person that they want to be. One of the most impactful conversations I had in my research was with a woman who said, I know how to be in an abusive relationship. I don't know how to be homeless. So I keep going back. And when people are victims and victimization becomes strong, and we don't give options, then we, as a system, perpetuate the victimization. And if someone told me tomorrow that there was going to be a permanent supportive housing unit in my neighborhood, I live in Mill Woods, I would be ecstatic, because permanent supportive housing or supportive housing does not increase criminality, and what it does is it increases community. So with that, I will go to the questions.
Great. Thanks, Dan, and thanks, everyone. I think that's good context for us to now move into our Q&A section. And so this will be the remainder of our time this evening. It's getting to your questions. And we have a number that have already been submitted that are great. So we'll be getting into that in a moment. But I do want to say that we won't be sharing names of those who submitted the questions. And where multiple individuals have asked the similar question, we will be paraphrasing a little bit. So let's get into our first question. Question is, supporting a diverse population with perhaps co-op housing options is supportive living to me. Transitioning the homeless in a rooming house with 24/7 medical and mental care is transition housing. One is integrated into the community. The other is something that will change the face of this community forever. What is your definition of supportive versus transitional housing? Emily, I think this is a good question to throw to you.
Thanks for the question. My first week on the job with Homeward Trust, it was over 2 years ago, I used the expression transitional housing, and I got a few raised eyebrows. And when you enter a new world of work and you're trying to understand the nomenclature of how people talk about things. So sometimes, depending on who you ask, transitional housing can mean a type of housing where someone has to qualify and go through readiness before they're placed in a permanent housing situation. And so that technically is often how the word transitional housing is used in the homeless serving community. And so transitional housing, typically speaking, is really not something that Homeward Trust does, because we ascribe to the housing first philosophy, which is a proven intervention whereby you move people rapidly to housing with no readiness requirements, and then you build supports around them so they can retain their housing. And so the difference between transitional housing and supportive housing, from my perspective, would be that supportive housing is a place that someone goes to live permanently or for as long as they want to live there. So that's not a sentence. They live there for as long as they want to live there. And transitional housing is usually something where someone stops for a while and then moves on to something else.
And Emily, could you just say what, in terms of the efficacy of supportive housing and why that more permanent place to stay long-term is considered a model that can help end homelessness?
Well, certainly, supportive housing is a really important model to end homelessness, because the folks that live in supportive housing have demonstrated that they need more supports to be able to retain their housing. So typically speaking, someone that may move into supportive housing may have tried to live in market housing or rented their own apartment and had someone visit them from time to time to help them retain that. But it just wasn't enough support for them to be as successful as they wanted to be. And so there is a small group of people that need supportive housing, and our work in supportive housing in this community has been going on for a long time. And we see really good results where people are able to retain their housing much longer than they ever have before. And what's more, their quality of life has greatly improved. And moreover, the symptoms of homelessness, which are sometimes exhibited as social disorder, which makes us all uncomfortable in our communities, greatly decrease or go away completely because their basic needs are met and they have the proper supports.
Thanks, Emily. Dan, we have a question for you. Many residents are concerned about safety. How does supportive housing impact the level of crime in a community? Does EPS receive more calls to a neighborhood when it has supportive housing? I know you spoke about this in your opening comments, but if you could expand on that, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Supportive housing actually doesn't increase crime in a neighborhood. When we've looked at our other supportive housing, and I actually had pulled some stuff to talk about with some stats and stuff, but we had a computer crash today, so I don't have it on me, so I can't give you any statistics right now. What I can tell you is that supportive housing, it doesn't increase crime or harm, and actually when you get right down to it, it starts to become reductions overall, because people are starting to have their needs met and go into places where they don't need that, what I call symptomatic criminality. What you see when people start going into supportive housing is a strong connection to community and neighborhood. And when you look at the Recover Edmonton did what's called the Soulful City report, which was a report looking at the desires of individuals experiencing homelessness and precarious housing. One of the number one things that was asked was culture and belonging. And when people have their own home, they start to feel that like they belong. And what we started to see, and what we've seen in the past at supportive housing units, is an extreme desire to be integrated within the community in a positive way. So it's an amazing way to actually reduce crime, reduce disorder, and build community capacity in a way that is different than other people think. And I understand the fear. And I truly believe that there is the concept of proximity. Proximity, when you have proximity with people, it builds compassion and care. When we see people as others, it makes us question them. that goes around, that is with individuals experiencing homelessness, individuals who are come from BIPOC communities. It is one of those things that we have to start to address as a community, and it's about having that proximity and building compassion. And when you start to see these permanent supportive housing units, you will literally see an increased level of community support, and there is not an increased criminality around those places.
Thanks, Dan. We now have a question about number of units. So many in the community are concerned about the number of units, and some have asked if this is more units than can be accommodated by the zoning. How did the city come to the number of units, that being 54? Brendan, I'm going to ask you to speak to that, and then Mike as well.
Sure, thanks, Kelta. Yes, the number of units for this project is actually an outcome of a few things. What can be accommodated on the site under the current zoning? So that would be, yes, we can accommodate 54 under the existing RA7 zoning. What is required to meet the need? We know that we can't undershoot that, and putting too few units on the site would be something we'd be equally criticized for, as well as what we have the funding to deliver. We don't have funding to deliver a much higher number of units. So all of those three things together shape that unit count. And we do recognize that it is higher at this location compared with some of the other recently announced projects in Edmonton. And part of that is because of the unit mix, the breakdown of 1-bedrooms versus studio units that Mike explained. Some of those other projects have closer to a 50-50 unit mix, and this project has more studios than 1-beds. So it's worth noting as well on that point that even if that unit mix were different, for example, if we had fewer units but stuck with that 50-50 studio and 1-bedroom mix, it wouldn't have a noticeable impact on how the building looked from the outside. We'd still be planning a 4-story building with a similarly sized parking lot, for example. And then I guess more broadly, in terms of how many units is too many, there is no established best practice to say stay below a certain number of units. The priorities and success factors for any supportive housing development, including this one, focus on designing a building that is well suited to the residents' needs. So Emily and Mike both touched on that. Also selecting an operator that can manage the site based on their qualifications, and Emily spoke to that. We want a rigorous intake process that ensures residents are matched with the supports provided on this particular site. And also we want to have the right operator and staff complement in place to manage that. So by meeting residents' needs, like Dan mentioned, they can then focus on being community members.
And Brendan, before we get to Mike, can you just confirm about the zoning? This individual did have a question about, is this actually in compliance with the current zoning for these sites?
I can speak to that.
Sure, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, so the answer is yes. We're trying very hard to stay within the regulations of the zoning. The zoning's RA7, and we're trying very hard to keep within that and not go after any variances. So everything from the height of the building to its setbacks and dimensions on the site, where the parking fits, all of those pieces, the amount of landscaping required, all that kind of thing is dictated by zoning, and we will adhere to all of those pieces.
Mike, is there anything else you wanted to add about the unit count and some of the questions about how this can be accommodated? I know you touched on that in your presentation, but anything else to add?
I think Brendan did a good job of covering off the idea that, if we did reduce the number of units on the site, we would likely be putting more 1-bedroom of the larger units here. So the building would materially be essentially the same size. It would just be able to accommodate fewer and get fewer people off the street. So by going to that studio size, the smaller 350 square foot units, we can help provide homes for more Edmontonians.
And then Emily, just jumping over to you from a program perspective, there's also some questions about, is it too many units to be handled by Homeward Trust? Are there any concerns with this number of units from a supportive housing model perspective? Can you just speak to that?
Yeah, certainly. Well, there is no one supportive housing that's the perfect mix, because as our friends at the city will know from working with Homeward Trust, often our answer is it depends. And so the success of a supportive housing site depends on many factors. It depends on who the operator is, and choosing a well-qualified community social agency that knows how to work with this population and knows how to work with the community is critical to the success of any project. When we're choosing an operator, we're considering their ability to meet the needs of the residents, which includes the scope and scale. So it would include the number of units. So what I mean by that is that we would be looking at operating funding for this community service agency that matches the number of people that are at that site. So we're looking at that staff ratio of staff to residents. Another it depends kind of answer is it depends who's living there. Some folks need quite a bit of supports and some people need very little. So as soon as you have a configuration of 53 or 45 to 53 people, depending on vacancies or that kind of thing, you're going to make sure that you have a good balance in there that works really well in the building and the needs can be met by the staff involved. And that's a bit of an art and a bit of a science. And it's really about having that expertise to kind of steward that through. I have no concerns with the site having 53 units because I know we have control over who can go live in there. And I know we also have control over who operates that site.
Thanks, Emily. Our next question is jumping back to some design elements. The question is, the design being shown suggests gardens and bicycle parking would be in front of the building. Houses in the neighborhood have front yards. This looks like the front is filled right to the street. Why aren't the gardens and bike parking on the back of the property like everyone else in the neighborhood? Mike, can you start us off on that answer?
Sure. I don't know if it might be useful to pull up that site plan again. We can look at that. It might not be necessary. So you're absolutely right that right now it's showing bike parking at the entrance. And so I guess a couple of bits of information. Some of the requirements for bicycle parking changed over the last recently. And we're, I think rightfully, being a biker, required to provide more biking or more bike parking, that's biking, here and at any development than we used to. So one of the things with bikes is sometimes they walk away. So keeping them front and center, and maybe Dan will speak to this a little better than me, but keeping them front and center on a really busy corner can help from a crime prevention through environmental design perspective, CEPTED, to keep them safer and less likely to be targeted and stolen. So in terms of the gardening and moving those, so we have a requirement for parking. Obviously, we want to be able to provide enough parking for both the residents as well as the staff. And I mentioned earlier how many accessible parking that we must provide. So if you look at that site plan there, the parking that we're providing takes up a significant portion of that back part of the site. Our zoning doesn't allow us to put parking on the front, so it kind of limits where we can put parking. So it doesn't leave a lot of space on the east side of the building for gardening opportunities. So that's why we've elected to put the planter boxes on the west side there. Did I get all the pieces from that, Kelta?
I think so, but for the individual who asked the question, if you have any follow-ups, please, you can reach out to us at supportivehousing@edmonton.ca and we can do a follow-up if needed. Our next question is for Brendan. Will the content of the city's land sale agreement with Homeward Trust be made public prior to the March 1st Executive Committee meeting? I think this is important for the community to know exactly what City Council will be voting on.
Yes, the sales terms and conditions presented to council are actually already available to the public as part of the upcoming council report that you mentioned on March 1st, the executive committee, and that's posted to the city's website right now. But the actual sales agreement will not be a public document. It's not drafted and it's not a part of the report, just the key sale terms and conditions are.
But is it fair to say, Brendan, that the agreement will be based off of what's disclosed in the conditions to council? So
Yeah,
there's
absolutely.
no surprises hidden in there. Is that correct?
No, that's correct. So they are in separate documents for each one of those sites, and they're the attachments to that report. So I'm perhaps we can send that individual a link to those documents, Kelta.
Great, thanks. Our next question is, why is public engagement taking place after the land sale? Brendan, this is another question for you.
Sure. Well, the site was selected in part because it's already ready for development and doesn't require rezoning. So the decision point for council is actually limited to the approval of the land sale. It's not the city's practice overall to engage on the location of any affordable or supportive housing. So the scope of engagement will focus on the Good Neighbor Plan to help ensure supportive housing is well integrated into the social fabric of the community. I guess on top of that, it would be premature to engage on the Good Neighbor Plan before the land sale is approved, which is why we share information prior to the sale approval and then hold public engagement after, assuming that that sale approval is approved.
Brendan, you mentioned the Good Neighbor Plan. We have another question here about, are there any examples of Good Neighbor Plans that we can speak to, what those contents are? Emily, can you walk us through what some of those key contents of a Good Neighbor Plan will be?
Yeah, certainly. I'll walk you through an overview of what's in a Good Neighbor Plan, and then I'll provide some examples that are happening in our other sites in the city. So quite simply, to operate social supportive housing, we need to have the support of the community because we are part of the community. And so a Good Neighbor Plan is really about articulating who we are, what we do, and how we engage with the surrounding community. So practically speaking, what that means is it outlines who the major stakeholders are in a community, such as schools, residents, businesses, what and how we're going to communicate with them and how often. Another really important part of the Good Neighbor Plan is an issue resolution process. So it's important that community members, if an issue arises, they have access to a publicly shared community contact. So the first resolution to resolve something small, and we want things to be small when we resolve them, is to contact the community contact and see if it can be resolved. But Homeward Trust also has an issue resolution process if issues get escalated that we handle kind of as a third party. So the Good Neighbor Plan also outlines that. We have a site over by Campus Saint Jean, and that Good Neighbor Plan, they're really well integrated into the community. They have members of their supportive housing site volunteering at some of the community, like the U of A community public buildings. Not right now because of COVID, but before COVID. That particular Good Neighbor Plan actually articulated the relationship of residents with the local pharmacist and how the residents were going to go to that pharmacist and how that worked. So that's just a unique characteristic, and that's why they're all unique, because it's based on the community. I was called to help with a small issue that occurred at a northern site in the northern part of the city. And, we met with a business person who was on the BIA, the Business Association in the area. And after meeting with him, we realized that there was a gap in that Good Neighbor Plan because it hadn't engaged businesses a lot. It had engaged a lot of community groups and neighbors directly around, but hadn't engaged businesses as much. And so that was an opportunity for us to refine our Good Neighbor Plan and to have some formal mechanisms to engage with the businesses around it.
Thanks, Emily. Our next question is for both Emily and Dan. Question is, due to the proximity to a junior high school and the need for impressionable youth to pass by the facility, will the residents be screened for prior drug offenses or crimes against children? Emily, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, so I mean, this partly relates to the intake process that I've referenced a couple times. And so as part of the intake process, it's often cross-disciplinary. We engage different sectors to understand who someone is and how what their needs are. So that's an important part of the process where we can uncover a lot of things. I think an important thing to remember when we're talking about people that have experienced homelessness is that that's not synonymous with being a drug addict or being a criminal. And so just because someone has experienced homelessness doesn't mean that they have those challenges. But if they do, we do learn about them, and we wouldn't place anyone in housing that violated any residency requirements.
And so when you say that, Emily, just to be clear, so when you say residency requirements, no, a person would not be placed near a school if they had residency requirements specifically regarding children. Just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, so residency requirements are just another way, I guess, of saying residency restrictions. If someone had a past offense that they were convicted of, and Dan can speak to that. So we wouldn't place anyone that had a residency requirement that would violate that in this supportive housing site.
Thanks, Emily. And Dan, would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, we work really closely with Homeward Trust, and these types of things we're concerned and we worry about those types of things as well. But I'm going to go back with what Emily said. There's an image or an idea of individuals who experience homelessness or precarious housing that they're, child sex offenders and drug users and all these problems, but that's not who these folks are. The vast majority of these people are individuals who've experienced some level of trauma in their life, and it's resulted in this circumstance that they're in. And I go back again to the concept or the conversation about proximity. When we start to understand who we're dealing with, we lose the fear. We work closely with Homeward Trust to ensure that we don't put communities at risk. At the same time, it's the vast majority of the individuals that are going into supportive housing don't put communities at risk anyway.
And Dan, when you talk about some of the relationship with EPS, what does that look like on a community level? Is there kind of a proactive relationship that's created with any supportive housing development, or is that more reactive?
It's absolutely proactive. It's proactive before supportive housing. It's proactive in the space of individuals who experience homelessness. Actually, in fact, in my previous role, I was the inspector in downtown division. Homeward Trust actually provided 1.5 staff to work with our members on what we call the barrier reduction constable, who was going out to individuals who were experiencing homelessness and precariously housed and trying to bridge that piece, because housing, although it's not a panacea to everything, but housing does a lot for people. When you are housed and safe, you actually, and I'll go to my research a little bit here, and it's just to talk about drug use, if I may. One of the issues around drug use, and specifically with our women that are homeless or precariously housed, oftentimes drug use is a safety mechanism. If you're on the street and you're homeless and you're a woman, you may do methamphetamines so you can stay awake so you don't get raped. And I'm sorry if I'm being brutally blunt, but that's the fact. And one of the things that we found with individuals who were incarcerated in both federal and provincial jails in my research side of my life is that when they get incarcerated, they're going places where they don't want to use drugs, to the point where we're currently writing a paper in relation to a federal prison where 100% of our sample didn't want needle exchange or supervised consumption inside the jail because they didn't need it there, and they don't want to use drugs because they want to move past the concept of drug use, because drugs were a safety mechanism. And when you're safe and you're housed, you don't need that safety mechanism. So we have this image or idea of what individuals who are homeless or who use drugs or who are involved in criminality are. And oftentimes our image and our understanding is actually lacking. One of the things I think that we've done, even within the policing context, we failed to educate our police officers who the justice client is. And in that, we've also failed to educate our community. When we realize this, we realize that individuals need support. And when they get the support, they're often successful.
Now, related to this topic, we have another question related to residency requirements. So, how are residents selected? Are there any conditions, and can a resident be evicted? So, Emily, this is another question for you.
So we have the intake process. So someone who is experiencing homelessness enters our homeless serving system, and we have standardized tools to understand their situation and their past history. Once we know more about that, we may, based on their needs, we may make a referral to a supportive housing site. And as part of that referral, there's lots of information that's asked for about someone's history as it relates to who they are, what their health needs are, if they have any mental health challenges, if they're needing any supports with addiction, where they've lived, what they've kind of done, just to kind of understand who they are so we can best match them in a respectful way. So I can kind of forget the question, but I believe it was about intake. So that's the intake process. And as part of the intake, the operator will consult with professionals in their network related to understanding that person's situation, so we can help build a plan to work and support them. Another part of it is I think the question about eviction. People can and do get evicted, for sure. They are asked to sign a lease under the Residential Tenancy Act. And if they violate that lease in a way that can't be resolved, then we will, as a last resort, evict someone. It's not something we want to do, but it's something we do. But to that end, I do want to be clear about something. Homeward Trust contracts an operator, which is a community service agency, to deliver the programming on the site. So they're responsible to support that person. Separately from that, Homeward Trust manages the property, which means that they would be the ones doing the eviction. And so I'm just teasing that out a little bit so you understand the structure, because the structure is very important. You don't want the people that's supporting someone to be evicting them, because it could be very traumatizing for someone. So I have been in situations, even as an operator, because we do operate one site in the city and I've had to operate another site to empty it, where we had the property management site evicting someone, but we're still supporting that someone so we can transition them somewhere so they can be successful. So sometimes we just transition them to another site, or sometimes they transition into a whole other thing. It really depends on the situation, but we don't just leave people hanging. We make sure that there's a support path through that whole process. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Emily. Our next question is for Brendan. As the land costs $1.2 million, why does the city want to bail out property developers making a living on rezoning properties? Wouldn't this money be better spent on hotels or building costs on surplus lands already owned by the city?
Thanks, Kelta. When we're looking for potential development sites for affordable housing, we work with our real estate branch to sift through developable surplus city-owned properties, but we also look at opportunities to acquire suitable sites on the market. So this site was zoned appropriately and was acquired for fair market value. As we've mentioned, the other 4 sites that we've partnered with Homeward Trust on are making use of surplus city-owned land. So we will continue to look for surplus land that will work for our purposes. And the city has also requested funding for proposed hotel conversion projects. So we're exploring all possible avenues to provide housing for people who need it. I would also be remiss to not note that there's no one silver bullet, and that there are usually pros and cons to each development approach. So often surplus city-owned properties require additional work to get them development ready, whether that's rezoning or servicing upgrades, etc. And that work has its own set of costs and also takes additional time.
Brendan, can you speak to the kind of inventory that the city has in terms of land? What kind of constraints are we operating with in general?
Sure. I mean, a lot of different business areas, departments within the city would own land. And so we could be talking about anything from a piece of open space to transportation remnant. So a lot of these pieces were not ever a developed piece of land, and sometimes they were left over from an infrastructure project or something like that. So when I talk about rezoning, subdivision, servicing, construction, these are all steps that would be required to get something, make it development ready for a use like a residential use. And so for those first 4 projects, 3 of them went through the zoning process and the city led that. Whereas in this case, this land, at least one of the parcels for the Westmount site, zoned, and the city did not lead that. And that happened a couple of years ago. Council made a decision independent of this project to rezone one of those to match the other 2 RA7. For us, not going through that process, but just acquiring three pre-zoned lots that would work for what we had in mind represented a time savings and efficiency. And we did probably, you pay more, you pay for the zoning, and that was the step we took on this project and not on the other 4. But again, no one way to do things, and we'll explore all of those options.
As a follow-up question around development, we have a question about how this fits into the West-Ingle ARP, and does it? Could you speak to that, Brendan?
Sure. Yes, when that RA7 rezoning was approved back in 2018, the West-Ingle ARP was also amended to align with that rezoning. And the West-Ingle ARP allows for low-rise apartment zoning along the 111th Street or 111th Avenue corridor. So there's no need to rezone these lots for this project to proceed.
We have a 2-part question sort of about rezoning and number of stories. Question being, is there any assurance that we will not apply, the city will not apply for a future rezoning on these sites? And also, is there any assurance that there will be no more than 4 stories for this development? Brendan, do you want to start off with that? And then Mike, we can go over to you.
The project as planned does not require rezoning. So that's probably the best assurance I could offer, unless something unforeseen changes. This project will be a 4-story building in an RA7 zone. Mike, is there anything you'd like to add?
Can we guarantee that this development won't be over 4 stories? Yes.
And why is that, Mike?
Of the RA7 has a limit of 14.5 meters in height, and that equates to 4 stories. So we have to keep our development under that 14.5 meters, which we will. There's Development Services does not grant variances ever for height, not that I've ever heard of. That's one piece they will never budge on, and of course we will keep within that restriction.
Thanks. And one more question for you, Mike. We have had questionable demolition and building contractors in the neighborhood. Will your crews be reliable, safe, and professional?
That's a great question. Of course, the city has really good relationships with our contractors, and we ensure and absolutely require safety and the professionalism from all of our vendors, including our contractors. So that's an important one that we don't mess around with.
Emily, a question for you about long-term maintenance. What is the long-term plan for maintaining the city's supportive housing developments? And I think we can assume that refers to this Westmount site. It is my understanding that Homeward Trust will hire a building operator for the site, but who is responsible for repairs and upgrades to the building over the years? Does the city set minimum maintenance standards? Emily, let's start with you, and then Brendan, if you have anything to add from the city standard side, you can jump in.
Thanks for that question. So this is a good time to talk a little bit about Homeward Trust has an arm of us that's a little bit separate, that is the part of us that does all the property management and the development. So we are directly responsible as owners and the property managers of many buildings around the city. And so those maintenance requirements are handled by that part of our organization. So it's separate from the operator. Related to that, there are supportive housing standards, and one whole standard relates to how a building is maintained. Truly, to be a good neighbor in a community, we need to have a building that's tidy and well kept and well maintained. And so it's a really critical part of our social license to continue operating in a community.
Thanks, Emily. Our next question is for Dan and Emily. Should be clear to everyone involved, as the communication has been vague across the board. This project is designed for near homeless and or homeless individuals that need 24/7 help to keep them off the street. These individuals are largely unemployed, have mental health issues and addictions to drugs and alcohol. Why would the city push this into a family-oriented community to have these individuals filtering out to our parks and alleyways? To be clear, this is not affordable housing. This is supportive housing for the homeless. Emily, can you start? Perhaps one way to look at the question and answer it is just about that, the individual's point around filtering into parks and alleyways. Can you talk about if you've seen those types of impacts with supportive housing and how that works?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really important question. And I'm going to take a little bit longer than maybe a minute and a half, if I may. I'm going to say that I had this conversation with my mother. So I mentioned I live in Westmount, and my mother lives in one of the seniors buildings the only seniors building on 109A Avenue. So if you know where that is, I don't remember the cross street. But she banks at the Service Credit Union on 124th Street, just past 111th Ave. And I told her that a new supportive housing site was going in there, the Inglewood site. And she said to me, she says, well, do you think that I need to change banks? And I said, why would you need to change banks? And she says, well, I don't want people that coming up to me when I'm trying to go into the bank. And I said, well, I would absolutely figure it's a failure of our supportive housing system if people are hassling people on the street that live in the supportive housing units. And so she said to me, she says, well, what you're saying to me is that it's not going to be worse for me because there's a supportive housing site there. And I said, yes, that's what I'm saying. And that's because that's what I believe. And the reason I believe that is a couple different things. Number one, a lot of the social disorder of going into alleys and panhandling or whatever kind of expressions, like walking around with carts or all these things, those are usually a symptom of people not having a home and not having supports. So they're not a symptom of criminality, they're a symptom of homelessness. And so once you solve homelessness by giving people a home and giving them the adequate supports, those behaviors usually cease to exist. And so that's one. Number two, it's the job of the supportive housing operator to ensure that we are good neighbors. And that means making sure that if those issues arise, that they're dealt with. And that's why we have a community contact and an issue resolution process. So if for some reason the supports we're providing are not meeting that person's needs and they're still perhaps doing things that maybe don't work well, then there's a way to kind of solve that. But ultimately, this supportive housing actually solves these issues, and that's why it's such a critical thing that we invest in our communities.
And Dan, can you speak to just family-oriented communities through your work? Have you seen particular issues arise regarding supportive housing as it relates to family homes and children around?
No, that's so. I'm just gonna. I think what happens often is we conflate the idea of shelters with supportive housing. Now, I'm going to be brutally honest, and I'm going to say something that doesn't always make me popular. We don't have standards for shelters in Edmonton. And I think that's one of our biggest issues. So the concept of carts and people walking around, and we have shelters that they let you stay there till 6 in the morning, and if the weather's fine, you're out of there. And that creates this discourse around homelessness that individuals are just walking around with carts and they're in back alleys, and very similar to what this individual question was. The difference between sheltering and supportive housing, not just the entire concept, but there's actual standards around supportive housing. And those standards are important, and they're met, and they become part of things. And what happens is, instead of seeing what you think you're going to see with a shelter, with supportive housing, you're just not seeing those things because they just don't happen. Because the supportive housing individuals are housed, they're not wandering around alleys and pushing carts and picking bottles. They're housed and they're supported. This isn't the type of support I think also gets to the point where I think people start to think it's institutionalized support, where people are doing, if you will, range walks all the time, making sure that people are in their cells. That's not what this is. This is an apartment with the ability to support people that are in the community, and that is the magic of supportive housing. Now, when you look at the concept of housing first and you look at it academically, when housing first occurs without support, it's successful for a certain population. When housing first works without support for some and with support for others, it's extremely successful. And I think we have to start looking at the academic research around this. I think we have to start understanding that there's a difference between shelters and supportive housing. And I think we have to also understand that really, when we get right down to this, dig right into this, this is humanity and compassion. And I know I think that it seems like it's a simple concept. These are individuals that have had issues, and they've had things that have happened in their life. And I can tell you, I have spent the vast majority of my career spending time with individuals who have gone through this. I can also tell you that as a 24-year police officer, some of my best friends and some of the closest people to me are people that used to experience homelessness and housing. And I literally talk to them on a regular basis because I've made connections with these individuals. And I'll go back to it again. Proximity breeds compassion and care. And I've made it my goal in life to ensure that I have a really strong understanding and a relationship with these folks. And I would invite that group of people to live on my block if there is permanent supportive housing here, because I truly believe that strongly in this concept.
It's interesting you say that, Dan. I actually live near a supportive housing development, and it's so quiet. I've walked by so many times, and it's so quiet. So yeah, I didn't even know it was supportive housing for a really long time. So yeah, that's been my experience for sure. So our next question is around, this is for Mike, I believe, and it's a multiple part question. So I'll give you the questions in pieces here, Mike. What are the shadow impacts? We'll start there.
Sure. Maybe good to pull up that fourth image again, if we have a moment, Ryan and Brendan. Shadow impacts on this site are actually very minimal. We're so fortunate on the site that it's on the north end of a block. So of course, sun's usually more southerly. So in fact, there's an image there of where a shadow would be, and I don't know exactly where or what time of year or time of day this would be, but it looks like sometime around noon, some point in the year. But looking at that massing model, it's easy to see how our shadows impacts on any other surrounding buildings are negligible. For example, 111th Ave is so wide that you might get a shadow across it in the dead of winter when the sun is super low and hitting that apartment building across the street. But it's pretty minor. So I think we're really well situated to avoid shadow impacts here. You had second part?
Yes, exactly. The next part of the question is around sewer impacts.
That's a good question. So any improvements to utilities that we need to do will be identified and confirmed when we apply for our development permit. And they base that on the number of units that are planned for the site. So through the development services, EPCOR and any other utilities will confirm any upgrades to this area's services that are required. So any offsite improvements or anything like that are required. So not just sewer, but anything else. So yeah. Is there any other parts to that question?
Yes, the last part actually touches on what you were just talking about, Mike. The last piece is, when the Curiosity General Store proposed an expansion, there were concerns over the capacity of the fire hydrant system. Has this been addressed, and who is paying for upgrades? And I think you can maybe speak generally, Mike, to if those upgrades are needed, who would be funding those?
So we're working, so again, we'll find that out once we get our development permit review done in terms of fire hydrant, if we need to increase fire hydrants in the area. That's confirmed through EPCOR, and as well as a project-specific review with fire rescue services. So if there are costs related to that, we'll call it, those costs are borne by the project.
Thanks, Mike. We've had a question come in, I think, on the heels of the earlier conversation, Dan and Emily. The question is, but what do the homeless that are now housed do all day if they don't have jobs, etc.? They will loiter around the community. Can you both speak to your experiences around that? Emily, we can start with you, please.
Many times when someone has moved out of homelessness and has to kind of get their life kind of all sorted, it takes a lot of time to do that. So you can spend a lot of time just learning how to clean your apartment, picking up groceries, cooking them, those sorts of things, meeting with service providers. So there'll be on-site staff. There's also, in the common area of these sites, there's also social rooms where people can gather to watch TV, to do games, like I mentioned, a kitchen to do training, that kind of thing. So there is some on-site amenities. In addition to that, there's some enclosed and not enclosed outdoor spaces that allow for good integration. So typically speaking, I mean, there are a lot of apartments in this area, certainly not as many south of 111th Ave as north of 111th Ave, but it would be just similar impacts that you would expect to see from any apartment building. And I guess that's something that I do want to really amplify in my comments, is that there's way more support and intake of who lives at these sites than almost any other apartment building that would be in the area. So it's a completely different supportive environment compared to other apartment buildings.
And Emily, just one follow-up. Can you speak to the jobs question? Do you find residents in supportive housing, do some individuals have jobs or volunteer, anything like that?
Well, as Dan said, you know, when one homeless person that you've met with has experienced homelessness means you've met one person, so they're all individuals. And so it depends, but by and large, many of the people that end up living in supportive housing are on AISH. And so they do have a defined income source that they know covers their needs, and their rent is matched to that. So that's generally what they're doing. So what that means is that who's ever working with them from a staffing perspective would want to work on how to integrate into the community in a meaningful way. And that would be based on that person's situation. So that could be volunteering. It could be just like learning how to go to the mall, or it could be contributing in many different ways. It probably just depends on the person.
Dan,
I'll give an example. Sorry, Kelta.
Sure. No.
We often talk about how to be client focused and to really listen hard to what the client wants. So we had one client that expressed the desire to be a rock star. And the people that were operating the program were telling me this story, and I was kind of like, well, I don't know how you're going to help him be a rock star. Like, I'm too practical for this. I don't know how that's going to work. But this is before COVID, what they ended up doing is there was a few people in that building that wanted to, that had an interest in music. So they had a weekly jam session at a community hall. And what the staff did is they matched that their nurse would come and see this person before or after his jam session. So he was also getting the medical care that he sometimes didn't want to have. So it's a good example of looking for creative ways to be client focused, which is what our job is.
Dan, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, our experience with other supportive housing isn't that we have these individuals that just have nothing to do all day, so they wander around and loiter in the streets. And I think that's a common misunderstanding. And what happens when people get housed is they start to integrate within their, and that's the nice thing about supportive housing, is there are things like games and things that they do in these places, in these spaces, that give them a community not only in their community, but also in the apartment itself. And it's this fear that we have of the unknown, of we have the images of what we see in downtown Edmonton, we have the images of what we see in other places, we have the images of what we've seen recently in, I'll use Seattle as an example, and the concept, the whole Seattle is dying thing, and that's not what this is. This is moving away from that. This is moving out of that. These are individuals that have gone through the the program, the Homeward Trust world, and they've been interviewed, and this isn't just like willy-nilly people like Emily said earlier, line up and get a place. These are individuals that have been chosen for the right place at the right time. And yet, do some people fail and get evicted? Sure. And then Homeward Trust does their best to find them a different space. That being said, this is a group of people that wants to be housed. This is a group of people that wants to be in a different situation and work very hard to maintain that when they get there. And it's one of those things that I get it, and I get the fear, because we don't know. And again, I'm going to go with proximity. And Kelty, you just said it. You live near a permanent supportive housing unit. And the impact it's had on you, based on what you just said to me, is all positive and very little negative, and if negative at all. And I'm going to say the same thing. When you have these places around you, they become very, they just become part of the community. And I'm going to use an example. There's a place called Urban Manor. Urban Manor is in downtown Edmonton. Urban Manor now, it's not just supportive housing, it's also a managed alcohol program. So I worked downtown division as a constable for 8 years, and I worked downtown division as an inspector for 2. Urban Manor almost has 0 calls for service to it a year. And I think it's roughly 75 people, don't quote me on that. It houses 75 people who have experienced substance use disorder, specifically around alcohol, and they manage the alcohol. And these are individuals that have had challenges in their lives. And that is a place that you just don't notice unless you mean to notice it, because it is just a community. And I've spent a lot of time in there. I've been inside there. I've met with residents. I've had conversations. And I can tell you the time I've spent in there, not one of those times has been as a call for service. So I think it's about trying to move past what we think and trying to figure out what the evidence shows. And the evidence shows that supportive housing works. The evidence shows supportive housing doesn't increase crime. And the evidence shows that supportive housing actually reduces the incarceration and involvement of other systems of individuals who are housed in supportive housing, thereby actually making the community safer and more well. And that's what we need to work towards, is community safety and well-being. And we need to work with that. And it's not just the police. It's not just social services. It's not just medical institutions. It's all of us. And it's part of the community's role to be part of that success. And I think when you have a supportive housing unit in your neighborhood, you within a few months, you won't even realize it's there beyond these conversations.
Thanks, Dan. Our next question is about what happens to the land if Homeward Trust takes ownership of it, but the planned housing project is not built for whatever reason? Emily, can you speak to, is this a likelihood? And if that were to happen, what would occur?
Sorry, I was having problems with my mouse to get off of mute. So, well, thanks for the question. You know, it's a good question. Like, what's going to happen if Homeward Trust isn't there to take care of this? I think that's the heart of the question. And so, from our perspective, investing in supportive housing is absolutely our priority. So in the plan to prevent and end homelessness for the city of Edmonton, it outlines a strategic priority that we need to have at least 900 units of supportive housing. And so fortunately, and I think COVID has actually, maybe there's a small silver lining of COVID. I don't think there's a big silver lining, but it has helped us secure more funding quickly from the federal government, which has made some of these units possible. So that is exciting because, I mean, one thing that COVID-19 has done is it's underscored that homelessness is also a public health emergency. And so there's no question that it needs to be addressed. And so in terms of our commitment to this project, it's important that this community understands there is commitment from 3 different levels of government for supportive housing, which includes the city, obviously, but also federally and provincially. There's also our strategic plans say that this is a priority, which I think is important. And then in terms of our commitment to having operating dollars is that we will prioritize operating dollars for these sites because it is literally how we can contribute to ending homelessness in the city of Edmonton. So it's very important. I'm just going to address the question a little bit differently too. You know, Brendan and the other city folks can say what would happen if we were to go back on our defined use of this property, and they can maybe follow up by email. But as part of us getting this land, it's that we have to fulfill the requirements of the site. So that's our agreement, and we have to do that. In other situations, there was only one other situation where we were actually head leasing a building and that we needed to no longer head lease that building and we were operating supportive housing out of it. And that's because it wasn't a good situation because the landlord, it was more challenging to work with the landlord because it wasn't designed to be supportive housing. And so in that situation, we just didn't just leave. And I think it's important for the community to know that we actually transitioned the building and worked to transition all the residents. So we have a responsibility and a long-term commitment to this entire community.
Thanks, Emily. And does that also relate to the Good Neighbor Plan? Seems like that's part of that long-term commitment is to not only have those relationships if there's issues, but really to support a really positive, proactive relationship. Can you talk about some examples through your work of how that's been done in other communities?
Yeah, so I've talked a little bit about the Good Neighbor Plan. And I think what's important about the Good Neighbor Plan is having the intentionality and the expectation in terms of contractual requirements for the operators that we choose for their building, that part of their job is outward facing and being a good neighbor. It's not enough to be inwardly focused on the residents. That community is part of a larger community and a larger community. And as such, we need to be good neighbors. And so we will contract a community social agency to operate this site. They will have the responsibility to have a community contact that's available. And then, of course, Homeward Trust also administers, and it's me personally, an issue resolution process for any issues that need to be escalated. So I take that responsibility very seriously. And I'm 100% available. Ask anyone, and a million people have my cell phone number, and I try to be super, super transparent. I never quite know who's going to be on the other end of the phone sometimes. So that's always an adventure. But it's an adventure that I'm signed up for as part of my role here. So I think that's important. And then, you know, if the operator had to change for any reason, those good neighbor commitments follow through, because what stays the same is that Homeward Trust is administering those dollars. We're providing oversight to make sure that those dollars are spent in an appropriate way. We have set standards and we have a quality assurance process to ensure that those standards are met as it relates to how that site is operated, who works there, what they do, and how it integrates with our broader homeless serving system.
Thanks, Emily. Our next question is about property values. Will the financial loss of neighboring residents' home values be addressed at all? Or is the focus only on the project residents and their well-being? What about our well-being? Brendan, can you speak to that, please?
Sure, thanks, Kelta. I would start off by saying we have no evidence to suggest that non-market housing, including supportive housing, negatively affects the property values of surrounding properties, and that residential real estate values, both assessed and sale values, are driven by broader local and global economic factors rather than just like the introduction of a new non-market housing building in the community. So like those local factors that influence property value assessments include the location, lot characteristics, like the shape and size of a lot, whether it's a corner lot, as well as proximity to commercial areas, transit infrastructure, utilities, or ravines, and the residents of a particular development and their income levels, or whether they're owners or renters, are not the factors that determine a property value assessment. In 2020, the city of Edmonton identified sales of 9 homes located near non-market housing. And in those instances, all sale prices were in line with the city's assessments or other sales in the area. So studies have consistently found that if non-market housing is well designed, fits in with the surrounding neighborhood, and is well managed, property values of the neighboring homes are not negatively affected. Does that answer the question?
Our next question is back to unit count a little bit. The question is, the listening mission report in October, Appendix 2, outlined that in the Calgary home space oversees 12 buildings averaging between 23 to 30 units. Why do we think anything above 30 would be okay? Emily, can you speak to that from an operational program perspective?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I actually, thanks to Kelta and Nicole, the team at the city, I was forwarded the question in advance. And I tried to Google that report so that I could more fully answer it, but I wasn't able to find it based on the information that I had. So I apologize for that. So I'm going to keep my comments more general and not speak specifically to that report. Basically, when we're looking at unit count, there is no, and I've kind of said this before, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but I'll just try to be really brief. There's no defined program model that says, if you have this many units, you're going to be successful. I mean, the answer is it depends, and it really depends on many factors about whether a place is going to be successful. Certainly the number of units is one consideration. A second consideration is the design of the building, and is it suited to the residents and the community's needs? A second consideration would be selecting an operator that has qualifications to meet the needs of the people living there, including the number of people. I've talked a little bit about this, well, more than a little, I think, but that intake process into a supportive housing site is so critical. We need to understand who is coming in so we can make sure that it's gonna, there's just a good fit in terms of community of the building and then broader. So, and then, you know, having the right amount of staff with the number of units. Those are the factors we look at to look at success. We have other supportive housing sites that have that number of units in the city, and they certainly, of course, dealt with community concerns when they opened, and we expect that and we embrace those conversations. But ask anyone around that site, they know that they're a great contributor to the community, and they're definitely helping with the community. So I can't comment specifically on studies or different buildings in different cities. They're all different systems. The other thing that's really important to understand is that the word supportive housing is not a licensed or regulated term. So someone could open up supportive housing and have someone who's paid minimum wage sitting at a front desk checking people in and out, and they could call that supportive housing. The supportive housing that we fund is for people that experience homelessness, and we have rigorous standards as it relates to what is offered and what makes it supportive housing. And so I just want to highlight that, because sometimes when examples are used from other communities, I definitely won't comment on them specifically because I don't actually know what's being offered at that site.
Thanks, Emily. And Brendan, is there anything you want to add to that about unit count?
Sure, Kelta. I'll still start off by saying what I mentioned before, that like Emily alluded to, there's no one magic number to stay below or to hit in terms of a building size or unit count. And I think that, I don't know everything about Calgary's situation, but the size of the pieces of land that they were working with had a lot to do with how they arrived at their unit count. And similarly, in Vancouver, they had a push to deliver 600 units of supportive housing, and were successful, and the average build size there was 60 units per building. So food for thought.
Thanks, Brendan. Our next question is about, let me just look here. We have lots of live questions, which is excellent. Would it be a good idea to include a few community representatives, perhaps from the Community League, to be part of the operator selection process? Emily, can you speak to what that selection process looks like?
Residents that move into our supportive housing have a right to privacy. So it would definitely be something that we wouldn't support in having members of the Community League be part of that intake process. So the folks that make those decisions are usually a cross-disciplinary team, generally with representatives from Alberta Health Services. And those are the folks that kind of look at that from a clinical perspective if needed, and try to add a housing perspective.
Our next question is about deliveries and access to the site. Will deliveries be made off of 111th Avenue to avoid blocking the street and alleyway? Mike, do you want to start off on that answer? And then Emily, if there's anything you want to add?
Sure. Be helpful to look at the site plan again. Brendan and Ryan, maybe you guys can pull that up. Emily will speak more to the types of deliveries that we can expect, which our understanding is they're fairly minimal. We expect most deliveries to be delivered to the front door, so off of 130th Street. And the types of deliveries would be quick. So especially now with COVID, we're all getting probably a lot more things delivered to our door by Amazon or Pure Later or whatever. So that's the type of deliveries that would happen here. So no different than the apartment across the street or the condo across the lane, or your house or my house. So we don't expect deliveries off of 111th. That's a major thoroughfare that we wouldn't be supporting that kind of stopping and getting out. They could happen at the back lane as well if it was a delivery that needed more time to unload to come in through the back way. Emily, maybe you want to touch on types of deliveries?
Yeah, so these are people's homes. So I think we would expect the same amount of deliveries perhaps as any apartment building. I don't think though you'd be seeing as much like delivery of like personal, like skip the dishes and those kinds of things. I'm just not thinking you would see that as much. From my perspective as someone who's operated these sites and someone who contracts the operations of these sites, we're going to see deliveries of furniture when people move in. I know that sounds obvious, but I'm just mentioning it because it's important. And then I think the other delivery we might see daily is some sort of meal service. So we do make sure that any kind of food security issues are addressed. And so sometimes that means that we'll have one or two kind of box lunches delivered every day that people can kind of grab and go. And so those would have to be delivered. But I see that as the most significant delivery that would occur.
Thanks, Emily. I did want to just return back to the earlier question about the selection of the operator, Emily, and just We have a follow-up, I believe, about just confirming that the request is about the operator, not selection of residents. Is there anything else you want to add with that clarification?
Oh, I feel bad. I misunderstood the question.
No problem. We just got to follow up to clarify that.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I appreciate you following up, whoever is following up. Yeah, so I should explain that process a little bit, because Homeward Trust, like, it's not me sitting here. I've been working in my living room for the last year, so it's not just me making these decisions, and I think that's an important thing to say. So we have, we are the designated community entity for the federal government as it relates to housing and homelessness. And we're also to have designations under the province and the municipality. And because of that, there's all sorts of governance structures that we go through when we make decisions. And so we have a number of committees that review all our decisions. So we don't just make them on our own. And so the answer is that the operator is chosen as part of our decision-making and governance process. So part of that process is we have an Indigenous Advisory Council, which is made up of leaders in the community who also identify as Indigenous or lead Indigenous-led organizations. We have what's called a Project Review Committee, which provides detailed review of all projects and new operators. And that's made up of, generally speaking, it's made up of the different parts of the system in the city and the province that help contribute to ending homelessness. So homelessness cannot be solved by homeless serving agencies. We really need the justice system involved. We need the healthcare system involved. And it's really all of those perspectives that help build a solution for homelessness. So there's a project review committee, and then there's a community plan committee, which has broader representation from across the community in different agencies and sectors that I've already mentioned. Those, so our job would be to frame a request for proposal for an operator, which means defining what the program model is, who they're serving, and what their operating budget would be. Then we would invite proposals for that, and we would review the proposals, and then we would make a recommendation through those committees, and they would see if they support our recommendation. After it's went through committee, it goes to our board for final approval. So in the current structure, there isn't room for community members to be part of that. However, our governance system is built on representation from across the broader community.
And can you speak to the fact of how an assessment is made in terms of good fit with the community? From our earlier conversations, Emily, I understand that it is important that, for example, a resident would be in a community that fits with their needs, and that maybe this speaks to your earlier comments about not matching someone with a development that isn't a good fit for them. So there is some understanding of community needs, and that is considered. Is that correct?
Well, I think that the danger with these questions for me is that I almost always answer them from the perspective of someone who's experienced homelessness and advocating for them, because that's my job. And in my experience of like doing these sessions, I've received feedback that I've taken to heart is the whole question of like, what about me? What about this community and how this impacts me? And so I guess I'm just not sure of the framing of the question, but I kind of want to look at it from both angles. So could you help me a little bit, Kelta?
Yeah, I think just the questions we've been receiving about how is the community thought of in this process in general? How have their needs been considered as this development has gone forward?
Yeah, so I mean, it was easy for me to kind of launch into how we look at the individual and see how they'll fit into the community, but we also want to make sure that we're bringing people into the community that aren't going to impact it negatively. So we would want to be looking at, you know, one of the things we look at is like, who do they associate with, and is that community going to contribute to any challenges related to that, or is it going to be a good fit? That would be an example. Any of the issues that kind of can come up in a community, to be honest, don't come up with the residents because they really want to be there and keep their housing. It often comes up with the people that want to visit the residents. And so that's where we kind of work really hard to make sure that there isn't that impact on the community in terms of where we place someone. So the other thing is we look for how they can be part of the community. So do they have any natural social connections and community connections in that area of town? And so that they can be a contributing member of that community.
Thanks, Emily. Our next question is for Brendan. I understand there will be 900 units built by 2024 in Edmonton for the homeless. My question is why propose 60 of those units in Westmount and another 30 units 7 blocks away in Inglewood? Can you speak to the city's overall plan about where those units will be developed in the city?
Sure, thanks, Kelta. I think if folks have followed the history of affordable housing and the city's commitment to that, you can see that there have been challenges and questions raised around concentration in a few core neighborhoods, for example, and how to reconcile the approach of wanting to add units across the city. So that's what we would refer to as a distributed model, and that's what the commitment is extending into this project. You're right, there's 2 projects not that far apart in this part of the city, but I think if you even look at the other 3 that have been announced, they're in further afield areas, not in one specific part of the city, one specific neighborhood. And that's the commitment we'll continue with the rest, is that we're going to look for sites all across the city, neighborhoods and sites that make sense and tick a lot of those site selection criteria that we talked about before. But also there's the notion of and the target for distributing based on what's already there in terms of existing affordable housing units. So there's that 16% target you may have seen referenced, and that is something that neither Inglewood or Westmount, for example, are close to. They're well below that target, and that's just another, I guess, guidepost in terms of where these units would end up, neighborhoods below that threshold.
Thanks, Brendan. I think we have time for just a few more questions here. We'll try and get to some that have been asked by multiple people. One of our questions is, many residents in Westmount have decided to send their junior high children out of the community, and we are worried this will continue with the development next to Westmount Junior High. What are the thoughts with this development being only of the 5 next to a school? And specifically, what safety measures during construction going forward? What has Westmount School said about this development? Perhaps I can share, and then we can talk about the school piece, but we have been in touch with the principal of Westmount School, who has expressed both support and no concerns about the development. Certainly we don't want to speak on their behalf, but that is the information we have when we shared information about the project with the school. So from that perspective, we've not heard those concerns, but obviously would be happy to chat if there are questions from parents after this session. Dan and Emily, I know we touched on schools previously, but can we revisit that and just talk a little bit more about if there's any other examples of supportive housing near schools you're aware of, or any other information you can provide to these parents?
I don't know of any locations near the schools off the top of my head, but what I can say is, again, it's this understanding or sometimes lack of understanding. We think that individuals who are experiencing homelessness are individuals who would offend against children, and that's a huge leap. I can't say that there's nobody that's ever experienced homelessness that's offended against children, but I can tell you, based on my own research and based on my understanding and the readings I've done, the vast majority of people who offend on children aren't experiencing homelessness. They are very, very different. There's a lot of nuance to that, and I could sit here and talk about that for about 3.5 hours, and I don't think we have that much time. But what I can say is the vast majority of individuals who are in supportive housing, that's not a concern. And again, I go back to proximity and care and compassion. And I understand that there's fears, and I understand that there's fears around your children. And I understand that people want to make sure their children are protected, and I totally agree with that. I wouldn't be sitting here as a member of the Edmonton Police Service supporting this project if I thought that there was risk to the children at the school. And I urge people to just think about this is individuals who want to be housed, who want to be safe. And once they are in those spaces and their label is lifted and their label of homelessness is lifted, the vast majority of these people are very successful for a very long time. And some of them move out of supportive housing and some of them stay in supportive housing. But it's about people, and it's about having these people, these individuals have a different experience and have a human-centered design. And that's where the beauty of the Homeward Trust group comes in, is it's about them. And it's also about the community, and it's about building community. And, anybody who moves into your neighborhood could be a risk. That's just the thing. We don't do criminal record checks on people buying our houses next to us. We don't do criminal record checks on the people that move into the apartment above us. But when we start talking about the concept of supportive housing, people get fearful because they have images of shelters and they have images of different things. And we've got to move away from that. And we've got to, it's about building capacity to understand and building compassion. And so what I would say to that is that's not a risk that I'm worried about. It's not a risk that Homeward Trust is worried about, and Homeward Trust does what they can to mitigate any of those risks if they know that they're there.
Thanks, Dan. And Emily, I'm wondering if I can add one more question as you provide your response. Oh.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes. So in terms of how are we tracking the successes and failures of this housing in general? Can you speak to that? And if you want to add a comment about what Dan just spoke about too, that'd be great.
Yeah, so when I met with Corey Fraser, the principal of, I think it's Westmount Junior High, she talked about how they're already, as staff and students, interacting with people that are experiencing homelessness regularly. And so being across from a supportive housing site is actually a great learning opportunity that talks about how we can end those, end that problem, so to speak. So I think there's a high level of awareness, and I think it's always a conversation that we need to keep having. And that's kind of something I do want to say. And that's part of that good neighbor plan, is we need to keep having those relationships with the school and be one-on-one, like know who they are, so that we can deal with anything that comes up. Tracking successes, what a great question. So what we do is we track, how long someone lives in supportive housing. We track vacancy rates. We track if someone leaves supportive housing, we code it different ways depending on if it was considered an unsuccessful exit, like an eviction would be unsuccessful, but a successful exit of someone wanting to move on and do something else and they're supported, that's super awesome. So we track also those kinds of things. We also understand how long people stay in supportive housing. And, we're able to see that they're able to maintain their housing where maybe before they weren't able to maintain their housing. Other things that we understand is we kind of document our interactions with the folks that live in supportive housing. And so, if we have interactions related to like medication management or helping with social development or skills or helping learn how to cook, we would track those and understand, perhaps looking at our interventions and how they're contributing to someone's experience as well.
Thanks, Emily.
I guess I should say too, sorry, we also track the number of complaints we would receive as well.
So we have just a few minutes left. And so before we close, I just want to give anyone on our panel an opportunity for a final word if there's anything else you want to share with community members that are tuning in tonight. No pressure.
I think an opportunity to have a well-designed, a well-constructed, and a well-managed building in your neighborhood only contributes to our community. It addresses issues that we see on the street from day to day. And I think there's a real opportunity here.
On that note, we're very close. We're at 9 p.m. So we are now at the end of our event. A big thank you to everyone who tuned in, submitted a question. We got through many tonight, but as we said at the top, anyone who didn't receive a response to their question, you will be receiving an email from us, and we'll be getting you an answer as best we can. We're also always available through our email after this event, and further details about upcoming information will be available. So thank you very much, and thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your expertise and insights. A recording of the event will remain on edmonton.ca/Westmount supportive housing for anyone who's interested. And thank you so much. Have a great night.